and good morning, friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on Indian writing in English, today we would be talking on beginning of national movement, society and culture. And for this discussion, we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Anand Prakash. Dr. Anand Prakash is a retired professor from Department of English, University of Delhi. So, dear friends, let's welcome our guest, Dr. Anand Prakash, and let's try to grab maximum knowledge through him. Hello, sir. Welcome to the EduSec lecture.
Thank you, Geetika, and welcome viewers. Today's lecture is on beginnings of the national movement, society and culture. And it's a precise topic. It relates to the developments in the latter half of the 19th century. And there were certain things that draw our attention to them. And these things, compel us to think. I believe that some kind of introduction to a concept is required to understand the points that I'm going to make. And that point, in precise terms, can be called present-centeredness. We live in the present. Present is important for us. Present gives challenges to us to understand it, to interpret it, and to learn specific lessons from it. And this particular present has to go towards the future, and therefore it has to be aware of itself. And the central concept of the present is supposed to be modernity, which has been taken up in some detail in the previous lectures under this series. And what is the core of modernity? Why do we call ourselves and how we call ourselves modern? This is important. And I believe that modernity and presentness, present-centeredness, and these days a new word that has come in the critical vocabulary that is called, the presentism. This is the word. So, at the core of this, in my opinion, is modernity, and that modernity tells us that we have to accept what we are. Well, as we say, it's a simple thing, appears to be quite simple, but go into the implications of this. I have to accept that I'm myself a body, a mind, a person living in a specific world. You also can say the same thing about yourself. The home also is something that is real. The world around us is also that is something real. Now, why I am emphasizing this? Why I am hammering this point? It is because for a long time in human history in general, and in India in particular, the present, the world, the home, the person are not supposed to be real. They are supposed to be a kind of an illusion. In fact, that Greek thought of Plato talks about this illusion. In India also, there is a whole emphasis on what is called Maya or illusion. We believe in the 21st century, and this idea also cropped up in the period that we relate to in this lecture. This appeared in the latter half of the 19th century, when we started saying and believing that we are not Maya, we are not illusion, we are not unreal, we are in fact real people. And this understanding of the real, in fact, tells us more about itself and us. If you have a world around you which is real, then you are real yourself. I am also real myself. And we are interacting with this world. So, real person interacting with the real world, which means that the real person is contributing to the world, and the world is contributing to the person in return. That, of course, takes us to the idea of what can be called the contribution and construction by humanity. So, society is a construct. Ideas are constructs. They are constructed. Then they are constructed by actual people. The traditions, the trends of behavior, they also are constructed by the human beings. So, which means that we are interacting with the world that is a construct. And if we learn, that there are certain lapses, certain mistakes, certain hurdles, certain obstacles that are there in our mind, then we have to take the blame ourselves. The blame is that we perhaps made a mistake somewhere, and let's correct our mistake. So, in fact, this idea of being present-centered, this idea of being modern, this idea of accepting things around us as real also gives us a sense of modesty, a sense of what in Hindi is called namrata. We become, numb ourselves, we become modest ourselves, that we made a mistake because of which things around us also were affected negatively. So, this is a point that is to be kept in mind, and why I am saying this in the beginning of this lecture is that in the latter half of the 19th century, India started unfolding itself as a reality. It was not so earlier, or it had started moving in that direction only gradually in the previous years. But in the past history, in its own past, it was not driven by the idea of modernity, and therefore it was not looking at itself critically. So, the latter half of the 19th century is now learning from itself. One point of that learning begins with 1857, as has been discussed in the previous lectures, and 1860s, 1870s are a period when everybody is learning from the actual experience that one has gone through. For instance, in 1835, Macaulay presents a minute, and that minute says, use English in order to influence the minds and value systems of Indians, so that finally they start obeying your dictum, your means Englishman's dictum. This is what he is saying. So, therefore, there is an emphasis on the learning of language, so that you create babus in India, you create people who follow the ideals of the West, and finally these people will give support to the West. Now, it's an idea. One doesn't know whether this actually happened, whether the principles that these people started popularizing and propagating in India, whether they served the purpose of creating a class of babus in India which would be black only in the skin, but in thinking they would be white. So, this kind of a argument given by Macaulay in the minute in 1835 had to be then tested, had to be then observed closely, so that he could see, and the English regime could see, and India could see whether this was actually the case. So, this present-centeredness, the 1835 onwards, the years that unfolded, that were seen, that were spent by people here, both by the Britishers and by the Indians, they had to then see whether this idea that they were practicing or trying to implement, whether this idea was real. And they found, to their dismay and to our pleasure in India, that you learn English, but learning English means you also learn English attitudes. And English attitudes are not necessarily servile or servilist or that of a servant. English attitudes actually are attitudes of equality. So, if you learn English, if you read English literature in these 1840s and the 1850s, then you start thinking like the Britishers, like the Englishmen, not the Englishmen who are here in India, those Englishmen who actually produced that particular book, that particular idea that we are contending with, we are coming to terms with, and therefore, if we are English in our habits and in our thoughts, then we will demand equality. So, this is what may have been seen by the Britishers in the coming 20 or 30 years, because of which I will come to it later and talk about it in detail, that policy towards implementation of English changed, underwent drastically in the later years. So, why did Englishmen learn that lesson? Because they were implementing an idea which was their idea. They were trying to understand Indians from the point of view of the Britishers, because they were active here, they were leaders here, the resources were in their hands, they were the rulers. And Indians on their side were also changing themselves by accepting this idea to the extent it suited them. So, just see that when you live in the present, you take present as serious. When you take present as real, and you yourself are real, therefore, you make mistakes. Englishmen make this mistake. I would not call it generally a mistake, but in the context that they were thinking that they will turn Indians into babus, they did not succeed to the extent they expected. So, this is the first point I make, that you make your time, you make changes and you are responsible for them. You make changes and you make mistakes in the course of making those changes. And if you make mistakes, then you can become aware of them, then you can correct those mistakes and that way correct your path. So, this is what marks the, let's say, the years. This is the distinguishing feature of the years, that are post 1857, the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. This is what people are active, people are practicing things, people are experimenting, they are making mistakes, and from their mistakes they are learning the lessons. Englishmen do it, at the same time Indians also do the same thing, and that's how history rolls on, society rolls on, it moves towards development. What was perceived in the 1860s is corrected in the 1870s and 1880s, and so on and so forth. And therefore, people learn their lessons and they make mistakes and they move towards some kind of a relative, correctness through pragmatic behavior. So this is the point I make, and I have already begun my argument in this sense. Then I'll start making these points in theoretical terms in this lecture, so that later on we can apply these theoretical principles to the texts that were produced in India in the same period, in the period where when the modern phase of India's history and national movement, and they are actually interchangeable in that sense, that national movement is a modern movement. That this movement began in these years, and that must have influenced the thinking of the elites in the country, the people who could read and write in English. And if they wrote in English, then they would carry the values that were being forged in the 1860s, 1880s, and on and on. So the first point I make is about the utility and social concerns, which now in the 1860s and 70s replace education, reform, and imaginative interests of exchange, give and take. This is happening. Schools have been opened, colleges have been opened, there are universities now, and these universities, they are replacing what was utility earlier. If you replace utility was there, let's say, in the 1810s, 1820s, 1830s, and that utility was, that you have to become as much practical in your life as possible. Utilitarianism was a movement in England in the latter part of the 18th century and the early years of the 19th century. In fact, novels have been written on the theme of utilitarianism and criticizing it, but then this was a doctrine that was popular in the early 19th century. So that utilitarianism, usefulness of knowledge, well, how much knowledge is giving us, because we are investing money into this and we invest money into this, how much are we getting out of it? And therefore, those earlier ideals which had been discarded now, those ideals would be there only in the background, and people would say, I want to do this, I want to get education because it is useful for us, it is useful for me. And this idea was replaced by certain other things, for instance, the forging of values, as Macaulay would have himself liked to see in the world, that he was giving lessons to. So people started, thinking of these ideals, thinking of these values, thinking of humanism in the latter half of the 19th century. Education policy of the new regime shifts emphasis from higher learning gradually. First, utilitarianism. From there is idealism, there are values, there is honesty, there is equality. All these things are being taught in the schools and colleges through English literature. Shakespeare, for instance, if he's taught, if his plays are discussed in the classroom, if his plays are also staged for public consumption, then these plays tell people about the same kind of features of human behavior in England as they have been there in India. So people start identifying with those characters that Shakespeare presented way back in the 16th and early 17th centuries. So this is a kind of present-centered knowledge of the present. In Shakespeare's time, his present is being interpreted. In the 19th century, India's present is being reinterpreted with the help of Shakespeare, and people are learning lessons from this. And when they learn lessons, then the regime also becomes a bit careful about what lessons the Indians are learning under their rule. So, higher learning is there in the latter half of the 19th century, and this higher learning then is being examined as being efficacious, as being clear, as being fulfilling those aims which the Britishers had in their mind. So, they are now getting serious about the activity of education, activity under education, and they are in a way monitoring, to use a modern word, they are monitoring the world in the classroom in universities, schools and colleges. And then higher learning, should it be pursued, should it be continued, should it be encouraged, should it be invested in, so that people become more and more clear about the ways of life, the ways of thought, the ways of feeling and all those things. So, the regime also gives attention in the 19th century to Indian languages, a new development. Of course, it happened in the second decade of the 19th century, when Indian languages too were given some kind of a primacy. School textbooks were prepared for Indian languages, and these languages then were made available for learning to the advantage of the Britishers. There would be some British people who would come here, they would settle down here, they would like to know what goes on in India, what particular ideas India is driven by, and therefore they are made to learn languages. So that is one mission of the British regime. And secondly, in the second half, which means the 40-50 years later, after the 1810s and 1820s, they then start saying that Indian languages should be promoted still more. If that happens, then it means that some money has to be diverted from the learning of English to the learning of Indian languages. Is it a good policy or a bad policy? We have the advantage today to look at it critically, and I believe that Britishers wanted that our minds could also be not exactly controlled, but could also be acted on with the help of their knowledge of Indian languages. We were beneficiaries also in the other sense that when Indian languages were promoted by the regime, then people became aware of their own potentialities of expression. They could express themselves in ordinary idiom because people understood language from this angle of a theory. In the class, the language is taught. In the class, the language is corrected. In the class, the language is improved. The language is made more precise. So people, while writing, they will think about what they are writing. And if they think and they write, then they also think about what they write. Think about what ideas they give. And that way, there is a contribution to the value of ideas. There is a contribution to the value of understanding of the person who is writing it. So this is happening in the classroom. And on the sides, I can say that classroom is not merely listening to the teacher. The classroom also is a place where you express yourself in the exams, near the exams, in the tests, monthly or quarterly tests. You write, and when you write, then you compose. And when you compose ideas, then there is a very healthy kind of interaction between your mind and your hand, which is writing. So this is the value of education, and this came in a very clear manner in the second half of the 19th century. Many debates starting from minute to 1840s, 50s and 60s to the last decade happened. Macaulay's argument, we had 2 lectures on this. Macaulay's argument was very relevant and very disturbing because this person was talking from a point of superiority. He had taken on himself the job of telling Indians what they should do, what they should think, what values they should imbibe. He was saying this, and he said it openly, and the document was discussed not only here but also in England, and the discussions there would finally percolate to Indian elites also, and we knew how we understood and how they understood and how the two understandings collided, clashed and interacted with each other. So this is what debates are. So many debates starting from minute to 1840s, 50s and 60s to the last decade happened. These debates are about the language policy. There are meetings, there are seminars, there are conferences, there are books written on this, there are committees made on this who go into the making of another statement, another document. so that later on that can be implemented through schools and colleges. This is concerning schools where curricula will be formed. People would be students will be told what to study, what to write, and later on how to adopt a particular attitude. So all this is concerning schools, and the pedagogy, the explanation, the other ways of teaching, like, as I said, like composing and expressing and debating, all these things are now in the domain of debate and in the domain of discussion. So schools, then technical education is being thought about and is being introduced, which was not the case earlier. And when you have technical education as a subject, as a course, then you realize that you are contributing to manufacture, you are contributing to our technology and production, industrial production. And this is only one end of the spectrum, but the other end is that people are getting their skills much more improved now with the help of technical education, with the help of education, that will improve your skills. Sciences, they are being taught. It's not merely literature, not merely Shakespeare or romantic poets or Milton. It is also, that sciences are being taught. So you will have later on homegrown scientists who would look at nature, who would look at certain energies that work in society and nature. And these energies, when they come for interpretation, then they definitely contribute to the capabilities of human beings as thinkers. They start thinking scientifically. They learn science. They use those methods also for understanding life, and that's how scientific knowledge also emerges. So this is the period which is doing this in a different manner than ever was the case in India earlier. As I said, that Indian education system till that time would not come to terms with the challenges that reality of the time faced. They would merely believe in preaching. But here the question was not of preaching, but of comprehending and of exploring. So people explored. They saw a problem, they studied it, they explored it. Then they got the some answers. Those answers were not always correct answers. So they would be implemented, and once the answers are implemented and they are not correct, then problems occur. And then those problems are studied. This is the scientific method. This is the modern method. This is the method that gives scope to intellect for becoming as much active as possible in those conditions. Well, technical education, skills, sciences, and then for ideas, imaginative representation, which is literature. Literature uses imagination, and with the help of imagination, we recreate conditions on the page through words. That is what literature is. Then political thought. Political thought is once again a very tricky subject. We should know that that when there is politics, then it has its likely effects and its urges, in the domain of thought, and political ideas can really disturb the equanimity of the rulers, their balance. They become very conscious about the possibilities of political knowledge in the classroom and through from the classroom through journals and other activities of social kind. And therefore, this political thought, which is also evolving in England and which is now coming to India, that is a matter of study, and that is, as I said, a subject which has to be handled with care. And then higher issues of learning, that happens. Indians turn to their own Indian languages because now the languages are taught, and even if they are learning English, then from English their attention will definitely go towards Indian languages, and they will find that perhaps through Indian languages they will be able to approach a larger segment of India's population. So Indian languages, the kind of development that happened in these years, in 1850 onwards up to 1900, that's the period we are touching, that was really remarkable, unprecedented. Indian language had not seen this kind of an atmosphere ever previously, barring a few phases in India's history into which we may not go at present. Classical languages such as Persian, Arabic and Sanskrit leave ground to spoken languages. Spoken languages is the language of the street. People use certain words, they use certain vocabulary, and this spoken language finally is formalized because it becomes a part of the debates that are talked about. And if there is imaginative literature written in the spoken languages, then that imaginative literature also get a different kind of a sweep and a different kind of influence. So now not as much emphasis is there on classical languages as there were earlier. Like all the great reformers of the early 19th century, they knew many languages and they knew classical languages greatly. And now this emphasis has shifted from classical languages to languages which are spoken in actual life on the street. A spread is seen in North India, and from North India it is also traveling. This influence is traveling to other parts of India, the southern part, the eastern part, the western part, and that is the spread of Hindi-Urdu mix. This is the Indian language. It's not a language at that point of time. It's a kind of a idiom that is becoming more and more popular. It is enriching the expression on the street, and later on it will become a language. But in these years, it's a Hindi-Urdu mix in North India. But this later on will become a language called Hindustani. Today we don't have a language with this name Hindustani, but all of us know that when we go to the market, when we move around in society, then we use this language. We don't bother about whether the word comes from Arabic, Persian or Sanskrit or from elsewhere. We simply use the word because it is useful, because it serves the purpose, because it helps us communicate effectively with the person who is listening to us. So this is how Hindi-Urdu mix will finally become a language. This way, the atmosphere is enlivening. This way, the atmosphere is charged with energy. It has a different kind of energy. It's energy of expression, energy of ideas. People are excited about ideas. They are excited about linguistic expressions, and therefore, more and more thought, more and more understanding is evolving on the basis of this churning that happens in the linguistic cultural field. Towards the end of this discussion, I would talk about, I have to indicate briefly one more point, and that is that significantly English in this phase goes down as a discourse in popular literature. Popular literature is not now written in English as much as it was done earlier, and this will create conditions congenial to the development of Indian languages. But then it doesn't mean that English will stop from remaining the medium of expression in the literary field. That will not happen. There will be still writers who will write very well in this phase, but then the emphasis is shifting from expression through English, even among the elites. It is shifting to Indian languages, whether it's Bangla, whether it's Hindi, whether it's Urdu, whether it's Marathi, whether it's Gujarati, whether it's Malayalam and languages like that. The emphasis is shifting, and that is where new challenges will finally emerge in the cultural and educational field. Thank you. Let's have in this discussion a reference to some of the important literary voices that belonged to this period, the period from 1857 onwards up to the end of the 19th century, 1900. As I have been saying all across in the previous lectures pertaining to this period, writing generally takes inspiration from the challenges that occur in life, and these challenges keep on changing. And one challenge which was there 20 years ago is no more there later. And in the meantime, new problems would have occurred, and these will start drawing note from writers, from thinkers, and from others, from the political orientation. So this process continues. Now let's take up three examples of literary expression, three examples of literary writing that were done in this period. The first example that comes to mind, and I'll talk a bit extensively about this as well as two other examples, is of Ramesh Chandra Dutt. This great personality, this person was born in 1848 and he died in 1905. So this long spell of life, this was very valuable for the writing of the 19th century. He was an able mind. He was a very intelligent, perceptive person, and he passed the ICS examination in 1869 when he was 21 years old, and he joined ICS. His capabilities can be gauged from the fact that in his mature years, he was asked to become the president of Indian National Congress. So from ICS, from that to the other field of politics, where he will be articulating the views as well as aspirations of Indian society and Indian industry. And this person will be the president of Indian National Congress in 1899. After retirement, that is, he becomes the president of Indian National Congress, and then he becomes Diwan of Baroda. Baroda at that point of time is a riyasat, is a state, and he'll be a Diwan there. These are the physical, or these are the career related things that he gets. These are those features of his life. And then personally, he's a scholar, he's a historian, he's a novelist, and he writes both in Bangla and then translates his works sometimes into English. See the kind of range that Ramesh Chandra Dutt has. A person who is absolutely bright, who is one of the best in the country at that point of time, and he serves the British regime at that highest level of ICS, and then he is so good as a scholar, so very knowledgeable about social and philosophical things, that he devotes all his time to that activity, and he is a great scholar and historian. In fact, his famous book of that time is the History of Indian Economic Reality. Then we are interested not as much in the history of this or that area of life directly, because even as he is writing in English, but what he writes in terms of literature. And for that purpose, we say that under the influence of, and with this inspiration coming from Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, he started writing novels, he started writing short stories, he started thinking about literature. And this is important for us. And the things that he initially wrote in Bangla, then he himself translated into English. This was the tradition in the 19th century, particularly in this era, because people knew two languages very well. Their career language was the language of English, and their other language, the language through which they would talk about the feelings, aspirations, the reality of India. Those things would be expressed, and the human behavior and other tendencies, human psychology. These things would be expressed through writing of literature, and therefore he also took to, like Bankim Chandra, he also took to writing. And Bankim Chandra had, after the first novel, which was Rajmohan's Wife, shifted to Bangla. So this person, perhaps with that inspiration, starts writing in Bangla. And then he had a large number of novels written at that point of time. And 2 of his novels were translated by him into English. And these novels are called The Lake of Palms and The Slave Girl of Agra. Slave Girl of Agra. So it's about a girl. And he knows so much about other societies and communities also, that he has shifted his scene of depiction not from, let's say, the Bangla region to the to Agra, and he will be talking about the life and conditions in that particular region. So this is his range. There is his range of knowledge of society of different parts of India. And the first novel, that is The Lake of Palms, this is 1902, and The Slave Girl of Agra is of 1909, the year when he would die. See his, once again, his capabilities. He knows Sanskrit very well, and he thinks of translating Ramayana and Mahabharata into English. Why? Because he wants to let people who don't know Sanskrit know what is there in India's tradition. And he also translated parts of Vedas, which means he knew Vedas, he could understand Vedas in the original, and then from there he goes to Ramayana and Mahabharata, and there also he is not able to write the whole of translation of the whole of the text, not only a fragment, only a small part. He is condensing, he is bringing things together, he is deleting quite a bit, and he is editing, and then it may be 10% or 15% of the Ramayana and 15% or 20% of the Mahabharata. But what he is doing is that he is making available for the benefit of the non Indian person, the knowledge that existed and the imaginative sweep that was enshrined in Indian writing in the ancient period. And there he succeeded. His cause was that to familiarize other people about the ways people expressed themselves and thought about life in the ancient period. This must have been a big contribution, and if these books are available today, then they will really be of immense help to tell us about his view of, which is a 19th century view of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. This is also very interesting, that when you are writing at a particular time, then you are not aware of this, that this is the view of your time. You call it as the final view. But today, as we are in the 21st century, and the way we read Ramayana and Mahabharata, this may not have been the way in which this person approached Mahabharata and Ramayana at that point of time. So our interest can be of 2 kinds in his writing. One, that his perspective is that of the 19th century Bengal, and the perspective is of the 19th century bureaucrat. And from that perspective, he is approaching these texts. And we might be approaching these texts again today, if we have the knowledge of the original Sanskrit, then we might be approaching them from our angle, which may not exactly be the angle of a bureaucrat, the angle of a person who is serving the interests of the British cause. So that way, there can be a fascinating, a point of discussion regarding how people took their own epics and how those epics later on were reinterpreted by other people in the 20th and 21st centuries. So it's really very interesting, and it's a great contribution to Indian writing at that time, and it shows that India in the latter half of the 19th century was interested particularly at the level of the elites, particularly at the level of those who had already read quite a bit about ancient India. So there was interest in ancient India, and ancient India stood reinterpreted in the writings of people like Ramesh Chandra Dutt, and this would hold a special kind of appeal for those who would be reading it at that time. So in the process, he shortened them, these 2 epics, as I said, but made them available to the English reader, and these were along with other Sanskrit classics, which I have said that he also translated parts of Upanishads and of course Vedas, and if he can handle language at that level. Vedic Sanskrit is not the same as later Sanskrit, but then he goes into the nuances of the Vedic Sanskrit and he renders them into a language which has totally different kind of thought patterns and different kind of linguistic and stylistic patterns. So negotiating with another language and doing it at the level of the highest learning, this is what characterizes the poetic and in the literary efforts of Rameshchandra Dutt. These days we do not know him as a writer of English in India, but then history books tell us that he wrote all this, and if this knowledge now is dug out from the archives and made available for the benefit of the Indian reader today, then it will be of immense help in the propagation of knowledge about India and knowledge about the 19th century India and English reality. Then we have another person who is also active at this time, apart from Rameshchandra Dutt. This person's name is Manmohan Ghosh. He is the elder brother of Aurobindo Ghosh, and he is totally different from what we know about Aurobindo Ghosh, who is a very eloquent scholar and poet, and who is a great visionary. This person may not exactly be a visionary of that kind, but he has his own propensities and his own distinct individual features. And he wrote in English, and he wrote poems, and he was visited by certain tragedies in life. He loved his wife dearly, and he lost his wife, and the way he saw her suffer, that made him very sad in his expression. And he had to go to England again and again, and would come back, and in the process he would be writing. He was in touch with English poets of the period, and some poems of his were published along with the poems of others, his friends in England, and these poetry collections then would be reviewed, they would be discussed, and people would take inspiration from them to write more and more. So this is what Manmohan Ghosh is for us. An elder brother of the more famous Aurobindo Ghosh. He is born in 1869 and he dies in 1924. And in these years, almost more than 50 years, then he is writing regularly, whatever time he has. Then one important thing about his writing, there is a poetry collection that comes out in 1890, towards the closing years of the 19th century. It is called Primavera. Along with his, it contains poems by a few English poets, and a very interesting thing has been said about this collection, in which his poems also are there, by Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde, reviews this book in a journal, and Oscar Wilde, all of us know, was interested in India, was interested in Indians. He was a radical voice in the 19th century, one of the greatest wits that 19th century produced, a socialist, and this person takes interest in things Indian, and this is what this is the book that he reviewed, and in this book, apart from poems by other English poets, there were poems by Manmohan Ghosh. About Manmohan Ghosh, he has something very interesting to say. So I noted it down for viewers, for you to consider. This is what Oscar Wilde says about Manmohan Ghosh. And he says that his verses show us how quick and subtle are the intellectual sympathies of the Oriental mind, and suggest how close the bond of union that may someday bind India to us by other methods than those of commerce and military strength. Very interesting. In the first part, he says that India has a kind of intellect, has a kind of quickness and subtlety, which may not be there in the English mind. Oscar Wilde is able to identify and to locate this subtlety of mind. Indian mind is very subtle. How many Britishers would say this, that Indians had a very subtle and a very quick kind of a mind? They would all say that Indians were not able to understand, and you can go back to the prejudices that were there in Macaulay's Minute. But here is a person, Oscar Wilde, of his level and stature, who says that Indian mind is very quick, it's very subtle. It sees things not merely at the level of surface, but goes beneath it, and there different kinds of working that are reflected through the use of the words, these come to us, and this kind of subtlety is there, says Oscar Wilde in Manmohan Ghosh's poems. And finally he makes a political statement. Just see how 19th century writers in England would sometimes talk of different things than others. Most of the people would say that England is superior, England is going to teach, new ways to the Indians, and they have white man's burden, they will civilize and made culturally, rich people in India. He is not saying all that. He says there is a kind of, sympathy, there is a kind of agreement, there is a kind of understanding and friendship and a point of unity between the Indians and the Britishers, and that quickness of mind, subtlety, which is there in the Indian mind, that is made available to the Britishers in these poems. So, a good tribute to the Indian mind by Oscar Wilde, but more important than that is that you can have a union with India, you can have a friendship with India, you can have a bonding with India, and that bonding may not exactly be that of commerce and military variety. Don't have to have a give and take at the economic level, and should not use force against them. And of course, Oscar Wilde saying this would mean that there was a reference to 1857 when there was a kind of bloodbath and Indians lost their lives, Britishers also lost their lives, and in that particular way it was a military might that was being tested, but there are better ways to interact with the Indians. And according to Oscar Wilde, the better way is to read the poems of Indians, and Indians should read English poems. That's a more friendly way of exchange than the exchange that Englishmen and Indians have with each other at that time. Then the point that I have touched upon earlier about Manmohan Ghosh is that he is a sad person. He is not a happy person. He doesn't want to celebrate anything. He doesn't want to write, about nature the way others would have written, like Turuzat would have written earlier, or Sarojini Naidu would be writing, around this time. He is not doing that. He is very sad. He just looks at things and he loses interest in their vivacity, and he thinks, that they are not going to serve much important purpose in life. So he is a sad person, a sentimental person. He just gives expression not to his ideas. Of course, his ideas would be the ideas of the 19th century, and ideas about human beings, ideas about relationships, ideas about friendship. His ideas would be there, but he would not express them. He would express, if some kind of solace is coming, if sentimentally he is attached to someone and that sentiment, urges him to write, then he will write about this. But then he doesn't have perhaps the mental makeup of a person who is happily moving around and enjoying himself. He is not enjoying himself, he is suffering. His poems are marked by that sense of suffering that he sees maybe in the closer domain of the family, or in the slightly larger domain also, because he must have been able to equate the suffering of the home, suffering of the close vicinity, with the suffering that was outside. I do not know whether he would be doing this very exactly, but then, being a sad person, he would definitely be thinking of the sad developments that are there in the latter half of the 19th century. And his own collection, the only collection he had in his lifetime, which was published, this was Love Songs and Elegies. Once again, elegies, lamenting, the death of this or that person. So these songs about people who die, the songs about death and suffering, this seems to be the characteristic mark of Manmohan Ghosh's poetry. And just see that there would have been tragedies at this time. We have some knowledge of the writings of Tagore of this time, of Premchand, who would be writing around the same time. Premchand starts writing in 1900. So Manmohan Ghosh would be his senior partner. Premchand would be just 20 years, and Manmohan Ghosh is reaching his 50th year at this time and writing about it. But then most of the writing of this period, I don't say ideas. Ideas are modern. But when it comes to writing, then India doesn't see as India much of hope. India is moving this way and that way, is struggling to find a voice for itself. All that is there. But then there doesn't seem to be that kind of a hopefulness, that kind of a positive idea which will occur later. The national movement actually emerges. These are the beginnings of the national movement. These are not the middle or this is not the heyday of that national movement, and this pain and suffering which is there at the time, this is what Manmohan Ghosh is talking about. Now there is another person, and I'll finish my discussion with reference to this person, and this person is not from Bengal, both the persons that I have already presented to you for discussion, they come from Bengal, but there is a third person who comes from Maharashtra, and his particular writing would be of interest to us. His name is Behramji Malabari, because he comes from Malabar maybe, so he's calling himself Malabari, and there is a kind of a political tint to this. If you call yourself Malabari, and if somebody calls himself a Hindustani, or is the third person who calls himself Rajasthani, then it means that the person is asserting one's regional identity, and this is what Behramji Malabari is doing. And mark this particular mark this particular distinction that Behramji has, that he comes from a minority community at that time, and he's talking in terms of his oneness with a region in India. So just see that a kind of nationalism is emerging. It's the beginning of nationalism, that the person is talking about a place and eulogizing it, and connecting it with his identity, and therefore he is making a political statement. So in a way, seeds of nationalism now are coming up. As you know, they are budding. The plant is the young sapling now. It can be seen, and this later on would turn into a bigger development. He comes from Surat, and he settles down in Bombay. Surat is a small place, and Bombay is going to be a metropolis. It's not already a metropolis, and he will be there. And Bombay would give him more chance, to come to terms with people from other parts of India, and his mental horizon would widen in the process of living there. He is engaged in social reform movements as a writer. This is remarkable. Neither Rameshchandra Dutt nor Manmohan Ghosh are directly involved with a social reform movement, but this man is, and he is from Maharashtra, and he is from Gujarat, that Maharashtra-Gujarat region. So one can see, that if at one place there is more of intensity of feeling, at another there is more of intensity of ideas, and these ideas are there away from Bengal at this point of time. The Indian muse in the English garb. This is a kind of verse autobiography he wrote. So somebody is writing about his own life, and this shows that assertion at the level of the person being there as playing a role. This theme is emerging in India at that time. I am a writer. This is how I lived. This is how I started writing. This is how I want to express myself. This is the subject of the verse autobiography of this person. His prose works are two. One is Gujarat and Gujaratis, and the other is Indian Eye on English Life. Not English Eye on Indian Life, that was Macaulay, but he is in a way answering that kind of a thing. Indian Eye on English Life. This is my view of the British. And Gujarat and Gujaratis, and he talks about their professional and about their social behavior. He edits journals. There are 3 journals he edits: Indian Patriot, The Voice of India, East and West. And see the range. He is using the word Indian very, very specifically. Then The Voice of India, once again India occurs, and East and West, which means that he is showing not merely a kind of harmony between the two, but also collision, also the difference. So you can see that this kind of political voice also is emerging in certain parts of India through writers who have taken to social reform majorly at that point of time. So just see that in these, let me in 1 or 2 sentences tell you viewers as to what we have discussed in this part of the lecture, that there are poetic voices, there are prose voices, there are novelists at this point of time. They do not compare very well with the writing that was there before, nor with the writing that will come later. But in this phase, some of them talk about scholarship, some others talk about their personal feelings, and there are some others who talk about those areas which will finally come to surface in the later part of life. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much. And dear friends, your feedbacks are very, very important for us. So keep watching the lectures and keep writing us at info.cec@nic.in. We would be meeting again tomorrow with Dr. Payal Nagpal. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.